The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're nearing the end of the year. New Year's Day 2017 falls on a Sunday. The first paid day in 2017 is January 2nd. By around noon on January 3rd, Canada's top 100 CEOs will, on average, have made as much as the average full-time employee will earn over the entire year. In 2013 and again in 2014, Canada's top 100 CEOs made an average of $9 million each. In other words, the average of these top CEOs makes 184 times as much as the average Canadian worker. This inequality is not only large, but it's also growing. Figures on the top 100 CEOs only go back to 2008 on a comparable basis. But if we look at the top 50 CEOs, an even more elite group, in 1995, only about 20 years ago, they made only 85 times as much as the average worker. So, Mr. Speaker, why should Parliament care if private corporations decide to pay their CEOs a lot of money? Well, because it's a lot of money that's not being used for other purposes. If you consider 100 CEOs each making an average of $9 million, that's almost $1 billion not being used to hire other employees, not being invested in machinery or equipment, not being devoted to necessary research and development. Corporate Canada as a whole would be better off if companies could pay CEOs less. But individual corporate boards feel the need to keep up with other companies. And this produces a circular logic to justify ever-increasing executive compensation. Mr. Speaker, even for the CEOs themselves, there's no real benefit to these pay increases. For one of the top 100 CEOs, another $1 million doesn't actually mean a higher material standard of living. It just means a change in the relative ranking. So our economy would be stronger, and even corporate Canada would be better off with government regulation to limit CEO compensation. Bill C-25 includes some minor improvements to corporate governance. But what it's missing, Mr. Speaker, is mandatory and binding say-on-pay provisions as have been adopted in other advanced countries. Canadian companies can put executive compensation to a vote of shareholders, but they're not bound to the results. What Bill C-25 should be doing is requiring companies to have votes on CEO and executive compensation and be bound by the results. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
When the House last took up debate on the question, the honourable member for Regina, Lewvan, had 7 minutes remaining in his remarks. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're nearing the end of 2016. New Year's Day 2017 falls on a Sunday. The first paid day of the new year will be January 2nd. By around noon on January 3rd, Canada's top 100 CEOs will, on average, have made as much money as the average full-time employee will earn over the entire year. In 2013 and again in 2014, Canada's top CEOs made an average of $9 million each. That means that the top CEOs made 184 times as much as the average Canadian worker. Mr. Speaker, this inequality is not only large, but it is growing. Figures on the top 100 CEOs only go back to 2008 on a comparable basis. But if we look at the top 50 CEOs, an even more elite group, in 1995, they made only 85 times as much as the average worker. So there's been an explosion of executive compensation over the past 2 decades. Why should we care if private companies choose to pay their CEOs a lot of money? Well, if you take 100 top CEOs, each making an average of $9 million, that's nearly $1 billion that is not being used to hire other employees, that is not being invested in machinery and equipment, and that is not being used for needed research and development. Corporate Canada as a whole would be better off if it could pay CEOs less. However, individual corporate boards feel pressure to keep up with what CEOs of other companies are paid. This leads to a circular logic that justifies ever higher executive compensation. Mr. Speaker, even the CEOs themselves do not really benefit from this trend. An extra $1 million does not make a material difference in their standard of living. Really, they're concerned about their relative position compared to other CEOs. So if a CEO gets paid more, it increases his or her position on the league tables only by reducing the position of other CEOs. Mr. Speaker, our economy would be stronger, and even corporate Canada itself would be better off with government regulation to limit CEO compensation. Now, Bill C-25 includes some minor improvements to corporate governance. But what's missing, Mr. Speaker, is the mandatory and binding say-on-pay provisions that we find in other advanced economies. Currently, Canadian companies can consult shareholders on executive compensation, but they are not bound by the results of those votes. The NDP is going to propose amendments to Bill C-25 to include mandatory and binding say-on-pay provisions to limit executive compensation. Now, Mr. Speaker, beyond the scope of Bill C-25, the federal government can and should also address out-of-control executive compensation through the tax system. I believe in giving credit where it is due, so I want to recognize that this government did modestly increase the top personal income tax rate. However, this government failed to close the loophole that allows half of stock options to be exempt from personal income tax. And this stock option loophole delivers the largest benefit to highly paid CEOs and corporate executives. So we need to close that loophole to address executive compensation. Something else that the federal government could do, Mr. Speaker, is to limit the amount of executive compensation that a corporation can deduct in calculating its corporate taxes. The United States currently limits the amount of CEO compensation that can be deducted in calculating corporate taxes to $1 million. Unfortunately, this limit is not very effective in the United States because it does not apply to performance-based compensation such as stock options. However, Mr. Speaker, we could easily apply a limit to all forms of executive compensation and ensure that they cannot be deducted in calculating corporate income taxes. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, out-of-control executive compensation is a significant source of worsening inequality, and it's a substantial drain on our economy. The Government of Canada can and should address this problem by strengthening corporate governance through Bill C-25 and also by implementing progressive tax reforms. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Qu'est-ce commentaire? La députée de Rimouski.
The Honourable Member for Rimouski, Nejet Témiscouata-Lébesk. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Regina, Lewvan, for his excellent speech. I'd like to ask him to, I'd like to go back to something he mentioned in his speech. The day on which a CEO will have earned the salary of the average employee of that CEO's business. You know, we often talk about the moment where all Canadians have paid all of the taxes they'll pay for the year, and usually that date is in, I think, July or August, but we don't often talk about this date, which is very important, which my colleague mentioned, and which I think has been amplified over the years because, you know, in the 1970s, there wasn't such a huge difference between the pay of a CEO and the pay of an employee. So I'd like to give my colleague the time to speak further to this element, which seems to be very important, but which is ignored by many Canadians.
Regina Lewvan.
Monsieur le Président.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent question. He's right. There's a lot of attention paid to the famous Tax Freedom Day, which is a day in the middle of the year where, according to the Fraser Institute, the average Canadian has paid all of his or her taxes for the year. There are a lot of problems with the calculations of that date, Mr. Speaker, but it's also important to look at other measures. And this is a metric developed by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And the question is really, at what point are executives in big business making as much money as the average worker? And it comes very, very early, Mr. Speaker. In 2017, that will happen at about noon on January 3rd. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to congratulate and thank my colleague from Regina Lewvan for his excellent speech. The question of inequality in our society is at the heart of our economic issues, in my opinion. When we see that the wealth gap, as my colleague has noted, is becoming disproportionately large, we've seen economic crises. There are all kinds of social problems, so in my opinion, it should be one of the major priorities that this House should be working on. My colleague talked about a fairly technical aspect, which is not well known by Canadians, and that is the fact that capital gains are only half of net gains are taxable, whereas a salary is taxed 100%. I'm wondering if my colleague could give a concrete example of that. For example, if you earn $50,000 a year, how much is taxed, and how much do you pay? And if it's a capital gain, how much do you pay? The Honourable Member for Regina Lewvan. Well, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Joliette for that excellent question. Inequality is a major problem in our society. It's an issue of equality, but it also affects health care, and it's at the heart of many social problems, this issue of inequality. He also mentioned a problem in our tax system, that's capital gains, which are only subject to half the tax of other income. And that's particularly a problem with executive compensation in big business, because often their capital gains aren't really investments, they're actually compensation, and it should be taxed at the same level as their income. Thank you.
It's the Honourable Member for Bow River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the interesting statements that the member has made about this particular issue. I wonder if he might want to respond to a different group of working people who I know that he cheers for, who are paid more than CEOs. That would be like the Regina, Saskatchewan football team, many hockey players in the National Hockey League who are paid more than CEOs, and what he might think of those people who make a considerable amount of money more than their CEOs in their profession.
Well, Member for Regina Lewvan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in my speech, the average of these top 100 CEOs makes $9 million a year, which is vastly more than the average player for the Saskatchewan Roughriders or in the Canadian Football League generally. So I don't necessarily accept the premise of the question, but I believe that there is a very similar problem with high pay for professional athletes. Part of the solution certainly is to increase the top personal income tax rate, as the government has done. But the problem derives from the fact that people are getting paid so much they don't really benefit from the additional money. It's all about relative position. You have to pay a hockey player a lot because other hockey players are a lot, and certainly there are more equitable ways of distributing that money in our society. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.